Thanks. This is just the greatest idea for an event that I've ever seen. This is perfect cross-section. I mean, everybody is so impacted by public transportation in San Francisco. So recently, when I've done readings, I've always just gone through like if I do something for a Center for Sex and Culture, I would just do a search for sex, and I'll go through my emails, and I'll try to find something topical. And so I just did a search for Muni, and this is what came up from a couple of years ago.
Can you speak closer to the mic?
Closer to the mic. It's better. Okay. I'll try to be loud. Try to be like authoritative. I saw a Chinese woman go down on the Muni this morning. A lot of Asian women in these stories. You notice that? She was old and walked with a cane, and her face was covered in scabs. She had a thick, round face. I sat between her and her husband. They were both coughing, and I looked for somewhere else to sit, but there wasn't anywhere. I never take the Muni to work, but this morning was an exception. Her husband poked her with a stick when it was time to get off, and she tried to follow, but she limped too slow, and when he was off, and she couldn't make it to the door on time. They stared at each other through the plexiglass. This is just a diary entry, it's kind of crazy. But they stared at each other through the plexiglass. Then the train moved, and the woman fell and hit her head on the steel wall. We surrounded her and told her to stay down, and she looked at us, and she was scared and maybe angry. I pressed the emergency button. The conductor asked what was wrong, and I told him. He said he would come when we pulled into the next station. When we got there, the Chinese woman insisted on getting up. We had to lift her because she couldn't get up by herself. Did that happen to her here? I was asked by a man, pointing to the scabs on her face. I told him it didn't. Her husband had similar scabs, but I didn't mention that. She looked beat up before she fell. She had stood at the door, and the door closed, and the train jerked softly, and she crumpled to the floor. Her husband may have been on the next train, or he may have stayed waiting for her at the last station. Someone took my statement. They asked for my phone number. The conductor pointed out that he had waited, that the doors had stayed open a very reasonable amount of time. He had no way of knowing in the back of the second car this woman was shuffling toward the exit. I was only on the second car myself to avoid paying the $1.50 fare. I know, I told him, because I didn't want him to feel bad. The woman didn't want to give her name. She didn't want to cooperate. All she would say was Montgomery. Cantonese? I asked her. Montgomery, she said. Mandarin? I thought I could maybe find someone to translate. She shook her head. She sat with the station attendant on a circular bench, then the train left. I thought it was odd how she didn't want help. She didn't want to document things for later. She would have medical expenses associated with that fall. I wonder who will pay for them. Or maybe she won't have expenses, just pains in her hips and shoulder, undiagnosed sprains and breaks, maybe a headache some mornings, new pains, indistinguishable, and in addition to older pains that have plagued her for a while now. But here's the weird thing. A professor was also on the train, and we had pretended not to notice each other before the woman fell. But we both rushed to her as she was huddled. I mean, we're sitting, 5 feet away from each other. We work together. And we're pretending that we don't see each other on the Muni train. And then the woman falls, and we both rush to her, and we teach in the same department. So the fact that we had failed to acknowledge each other previously was odd. But we didn't address it. We talked from there to the transfer station. He told me he wrote a column about wine for a free newspaper in Napa. He only taught 2 quarters each year, 3 days a week. He was a semi-famous poet, well-respected in his own world, one of only 2 poetry professors. I told him, it's hard to make a living writing what you want to write. I mentioned politics in New York. He said he had a friend in New York, and he'd be happy to put me in touch with him if I ever needed him to. At the transfer station, we talked about writing and the pay and the energy you put into it. He said, He had once had a wife and child, but was unable to maintain that. He said something along the lines of leaving that whole world. He made it sound like writing was incompatible with love. On top of that, he said, you have to make a living. He was 20 years older than me, at least, and there was a certain dashing to him. His hair had receded over half his head, but he still had some curls in the back. He had dark marks on his cheek. I thought he must be a profoundly lonely person. I knew that he had an affair with a poetry fellow once, a woman my age, that was in a workshop he gave. It was very public and strange. She was ambitious, attractive, and when she was in town, would invite me out with various famous writers of the kind that occupied a world that wasn't even open to the working poet like her. She was chasing someone past her means, and I never went. And he, the professor, had sat straight-backed, wearing orange sunglasses on the Muni until a Chinese woman fell. The woman stared up at us, and we surrounded her. 2 university teachers and another man with a beard. She doesn't speak the language, the professor said. At the transfer point, 20 or 15 minutes after the woman fell, I stopped to punch my train card. Listen, he said, I'm going to get a coffee and something to eat over there. Then I'm going to get a seat on the train and get some work done. In other words, our conversation was over. I was impressed by his inoffensive clarity. The old woman who had fallen was limping slower, but was probably reunited with her husband by now. I didn't want to stop talking to the professor. I wanted to know everything there was to know about the wife and child he had left behind. I wanted to hear all of his mistakes so I could avoid making them. I was almost interested enough to read his poems, but I never would do that. Instead, I said, okay, and gave this kind of half wave and hid behind the punch machine until he had boarded the train and watched to see what car he got on before boarding the train myself and taking my seat. Thank you.